All right, in this video, we are going to finish up talking about bones. And so we left off with talking about kind of the structure of bone tissue and reviewing compact versus spongy bone. So now we're going to talk about ossification. So this is how bones are formed, okay? And so there's two types of ossification, and they differ based on the tissue that is kind of the template for the bone, the starting point for the bone. So with intramembranous ossification, we're starting with fibrous connective tissue. That's kind of our template for the bone. Okay, and so with intramembranous ossification, this is going to happen with, this is how flat bones are formed. All right, so these would be like the bones that form your skull and your cranium. All right, also this is how your clavicle is formed, as well as your mandible, so your jawbone. Okay, they're formed through intramembranous ossification. So they start your skull, right, as when you're developing in the womb, starts as this connective tissue layer that is then converted into bone. Okay, so we're starting with fibrous connective tissue. So we have some kind of fibroblasts, and we have a lot of collagen fibers all running around. Okay, so let's go through the stages of intramembranous ossification. So with this, we start out with the formation of an ossification center. All right, and so all that means is that we have cells. All right, these are going to be mesenchymal cells. So these are kind of like a type of stem cell. All right, so mesenchymal cells that are going to be converted into our osteoprogenitor cells that we talked about in that last video. All right. And then those osteoprogenitor cells, can mature into osteoblasts. Okay. And so this is going to happen at one specific point, typically kind of in the center of where that bone is going to be. So if we're thinking of, maybe one of our skull bones, all right, a flat bone like this, we would have a little point here. That's our ossification center. So this point where those mesenchymal cells convert to osteoprogenitor cells and then to osteoblasts, all right? And then from there, we're going to spread outward, all right? Spreading that ossification throughout the bone until you reach the edges, okay? So we have the ossification center, all right? Once that forms, that's our first step. Our second step is that those osteoblasts are now going to start secreting matrix, okay? And that matrix, all right, is osteoid, all right? So that's going to be secreted by osteoblasts, okay? So they're going to start laying down the bone of the matrix, all right? And so then that osteoid is going to calcify. All right, when it calcifies around those osteoblasts are now going to become osteocytes. All right. Okay. Sites. All right, so now these are osteocytes in their lacunae. All right, and so then we still have some osteoblasts here, right, laying down that osteoid. But once they become trapped in that calcified osteoid, they're now the osteocytes in their lacunae. Okay. Then next, we're going to start remodeling that bone tissue that we've laid down. Okay, and so what's going to happen first is that trabeculae form. So you always, when you're making bone tissue, you lay down that osteoid. You first make it into spongy bone, and then that spongy bone can be converted into compact bone. Okay, so we're going to make spongy bone. by forming trabeculae, all right? And then at this time, this is going to fill with red bone marrow. All right, so fills with red bone marrow. All right, so that's going to fill up all those spaces around the trabeculae. And then from there, we can remodel that kind of spongy bone tissue into compact bone. All right, and so you can see that here. So we have our compact bone is kind of forming out here, right, with more of our spongy bone towards the middle. Okay, and that's how our flat bones are arranged. So with a flat bone, which is what we're making typically here with our intramembranous, you have, if this is kind of a cross section through our flat bone, right, you would have compact bone, all right, on either side, on the edges. And then in the middle, you have spongy bones. We'll just make that kind of a wider mesh, okay? So we would remodel the spongy bone to form that compact bone that's on the edges, and then leave the spongy bone in the middle, and that's what makes up our flat bones, all right? And so in the skull, for example, as we said, this starts in the middle of the bone and it moves out towards the edges. And so that's why when a baby is born, they have that soft spot on their skull that is called a fontanelle. All right, so the fontanelle is the soft spot, and this is just a spot where the connective tissue, that fibrous connective tissue that is going to be bone, has not fully ossified yet. All right, so this is a soft spot on the baby's skull. And so it typically, you can see it, right? It's actually where multiple bones of the skull meet together. And so the edges of those bones haven't fully ossified yet, and that leaves a soft spot. And that soft spot is really important for childbirth, right? And allowing some flexibility of the baby's skull during childbirth and going through the birth canal. All right. Okay, so that's intramembranous ossification. The second way you can make a bone is called endochondral ossification. All right. So chondral refers to cartilage. Okay, and so this is going to be through hyaline cartilage. So you're going to start with a hyaline cartilage template of a bone, and you're going to ossify it to actually make the bone. Okay, so let's go through the steps of endochondral ossification. All right, and so the bones that would undergo this would be essentially any other bone. In particular, long bones would be formed this way. The bones of your wrist and your ankles would be formed this way. Your ribs, your vertebrae, all right, all going to be formed that way. Okay, so the first step for endochondral ossification is that we are going to form a bone collar. And so that bone collar forms along the diaphysis of that hyaline cartilage template, okay? So this is our hyaline cartilage. All right, all this blue. So we're gonna have a bone collar that forms along the diaphysis, all right? And so that means that we have cells here along the edge of that template that have become osteoprogenitor cells and then osteoblasts. And so now those osteoblasts are laying down some osteoid to calcify this area along the edges. Okay, and so we form that bone collar. All right, and so then our next step is that in the middle of the diaphysis, all right, chondrocytes are going to start dying. So this is in the middle of the diaphysis. Okay. Chondrocytes are going to start to die, and that gives way for the formation of an ossification center. All right, so chondrocytes die, and then in our next step, blood vessels are going to penetrate that area where those chondrocytes have died, and that becomes our primary ossification center. Okay, so blood vessels are going to penetrate, and through those blood vessels, they're going to bring the osteoprogenitor cells. All right, so this brings osteoprogenitor cells into that internal part of the bone. Oops, running out of room. Okay. So again, like we said before, those osteoprogenitor cells will become osteoblasts. They can start laying down matrix. All right, as they lay down the matrix and it calcifies, surrounds the cells, they become osteocytes, right? Similar to what we just saw with our intramembranous ossification. Okay, and so remember, we always form spongy bone first, all right? So we're going to form spongy bone in this middle part, this primary ossification center, which is found in the diaphysis of the forming bone. All right, and so that process continues, and that spongy bone forms throughout the diaphysis of the bone. All right, and so then we can see in the next picture, a couple things have happened. All right, so first, we've remodeled some of that spongy bone tissue in the diaphysis, all right, has been remodeled to compact bone. Okay. Along the edges, we do have spongy bone in the middle, right, but we're remodeling the edges to compact bone. And now we have two additional points in the epiphyses where ossification is occurring. So in the epiphyses, the cartilage cells are going to start dying just like we saw in the diaphysis. So we'd have cartilage cells starting to die here and here. Blood vessels are going to penetrate and bring osteoprogenitor cells, and those cells will start laying down osteoid. That makes this our secondary ossification center. So we have two secondary ossification centers. All right, these are going to be in the epiphyses. All right, so you have one in each epiphysis. Okay, so secondary here, secondary here. All right, and our primary was in the diaphysis. Okay, and so then the process, as we've been discussing it, will continue there. So we lay down our osteoid, the cells become trapped, become osteocytes. This is spongy bone. It can be remodeled, right, to be compact bone. We can see kind of along the edges. And then the central region here in the epiphysis remains spongy bone. Okay? All right. And so what we end up with at the end of this ossification process is a bone very similar to what we see here. Okay? And so we know with our long bones, we talked about at the beginning of the chapter, there are two areas of hyaline cartilage that remain. Okay, so one of them is this epiphyseal plate. All right, and the other one is the articular cartilage. All right, and so that's on the ends. Okay, and so now you can see where those came from. So the epiphyseal plate comes from where this primary ossification center meets with the secondary ossification center, and you just have a little remaining area of hyaline cartilage. All right, and then our articular cartilage just remains from, it's kind of the edge of where that secondary ossification center was. Okay, so those are our two remaining areas of hyaline cartilage. All right, that don't completely ossify, at least not right away. All right, we know the epiphyseal plate does in adults, right, but not in adolescents and children. Okay. All right, good. So that's ossification. So intramembranous and endochondral. Let's talk about how bones grow. Okay, so bone growth. So bones can grow either in length or in width. Okay, so we'll talk about each. All right, And so with bone growth, we say it is either appositional or it is interstitial. Appositional refers to growth that occurs on the edges. All right, so if you're adding bone tissue or, osteoid matrix to the outside, all right, that would be appositional growth. And then interstitial, all right, would be growth that would be from the inside. All right, and it kind of would tend to move outward. Okay, and so let's talk about bone growing in length first. All right, and so with bone growing in length, you can kind of consider it both appositional and interstitial. All right, and so bone grows in length at the epiphyseal plate. Okay, so this is all happening at the epiphyseal plate. All right, and so bone growing in length is considered appositional because bone is being deposited on the diaphyseal side of the epiphyseal plate. Okay, and I'm writing that just because it can be a little confusing. Okay, and so that means if this is our epiphyseal plate, all right, we have a diaphyseal side over here, right, the side facing the diaphysis. We have the epiphyseal side here. Okay, and so we are adding for bone growing in length, it's going to be adding to this side, right? So bone is being added from the plate, right, onto existing bone. That's why it's considered appositional. All right, so it's going to be added like that. Okay, so it's added onto the diaphyseal side. All right, you're adding more bone tissue to the existing bone. And so that's why as bones grow in length, right, it's not the epiphysis that's getting longer, right? It's going to be the diaphysis that gets longer because you're adding more and more bone tissue to that diaphyseal side. Okay, and then I think it's a little more understandable why it's also considered interstitial, because you are technically adding bone tissue to the internal area of a bone, right? We're not adding it in this example along the edges of the bone here. It's kind of a little more inside. So it's also kind of an interstitial form of growth. All right. Okay, so that's growing in length. Bone can also change and grow in width. So typically this is the type of bone growth that occurs when you're an adult. All right, it also occurs when you're, growing up and your bones are adjusting to, weight gain as you get older, increasing muscle mass, that kind of thing with puberty. But as an adult, the diaphyseal plate is converted into a diaphyseal line. So bone growth in length cannot occur, all right? So you can only grow your bones and change the kind of density, right? How wide or, narrow your bones are. So that growing in width, okay? And so this is strictly appositional, and it occurs at the periosteum, all right? The osteogenic layer of the periosteum. Okay, so for this, all right, you're gonna have bone tissue is just deposited, right, all along the edges. Okay, so you can have bone growth like this. All right, so you'd be adding it to the edges, and then you can make the bone thicker. You can have osteoclasts that'll break down the bone and kind of, make it more narrow to change the width of the bone. All right. Okay, so that's bone growth in width versus length. All right, so let's talk about another really important function of bone, which is calcium homeostasis. Okay, so we know bones, one of the big functions of bones is to act as a storage of, the really important minerals, right? It's particularly calcium. Okay, and so how does your body regulate that calcium? All right, and so calcium homeostasis indicates that blood calcium, all right, is kept stable. Okay, so how is it kept stable? This is going to involve two hormones. So the first one is parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid hormone is secreted by the parathyroid gland. All right, so from the parathyroid gland. Okay, and so what parathyroid hormone is going to do is it's going to increase blood calcium, and it does that by activating osteoclasts. All right, so it's going to activate osteoclasts. So then those osteoclasts are going to break down bone, and as they do, they're going to be removing that calcium from the bone they're breaking down and depositing it into the blood. All right, so we're going to break down bone. Okay, and then add that to the blood. Okay, that calcium that's being removed. All right, so that's one way. So if your blood calcium is too low, all right, your parathyroid gland is going to release parathyroid hormone, and that will help to bring your blood calcium back up. All right, so then the other end, if your blood calcium gets too high, your thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin. All right, so this is made by the thyroid gland. Okay, and so it's going to help to lower blood calcium, and so it does that by inhibiting osteoclasts. Okay, so it's going to inhibit osteoclasts. All right, and I usually think of this as the osteoclasts and osteoblasts are kind of always going to be active, right? And they're active at the same time. So with these hormones, if you're making the osteoclasts more active with parathyroid hormone, you're going to be breaking down more bone, right? With calcitonin, if you inhibit those osteoclasts, then the osteoblasts are working harder, right? So you're not taking out as much calcium from bone. The osteoblasts are still working, so they're going to be putting calcium back into the bone, okay? So they're both osteoclasts and blasts working at the same time. These hormones really only affect the osteoclasts, right? The osteoblasts just keep doing their thing kind of at a constant rate. Okay, so this is an example of a negative feedback mechanism. All right, just like we talked about body temperature, we talked about blood sugar, calcium homeostasis would be another example. All right. Then our last topic for this chapter has to do with damage to bones. When bones are damaged, how does a bone break or fracture repair? Okay, so we're going to go through the steps of bone repair. All right, and obviously how long this process takes dramatically differs just depending on the type of bone break or fracture and the severity that we're talking about. All right, so the very first step in bone repair is the formation of a hematoma. Okay, and so that is a blood clot. So we know bone tissue is full of blood vessels. Those Haversian and Volkmann canals are chock full of blood vessels. And so when a bone breaks, you do tear those blood vessels and there is bleeding. So you need to first stop that bleeding. All right, and so that happens by the formation of a hematoma. Okay, so that first step, stop the bleeding. All right, we're going to form a blood clot. Our second step is that we're going to form a callus. All right, this callus is made of fibrocartilage. All right, so we make a fibrocartilage callus. All right, and that is essentially gonna form like a bridge between the broken ends of the bone. Okay, sometimes this is also called a soft soft callus. All right. And it's going to bridge the broken pieces. Okay, bridge broken ends. Good. And so that's the first step. Okay, so you make kind of like a fibrocartilage bridge across the damaged area. All right, and that also serves as a template for the repair, because we know, we just talked about endochondral ossification. That cartilage can then be converted into spongy bone. All right, and then that becomes our hard callus. All right, so we go from the soft callus, we convert it to a hard callus by converting it into spongy bone. Okay, and then that spongy bone can be remodeled as needed into compact bone. You can kind of, shape it, that kind of thing. Your cells will do this, all right? To be a more functional area, right, on that bone that was broken. Okay? All right. So that's the steps. And then just to talk about types of fractures really quick. So just a few. We're not going into a lot of detail. So fractures can be classified as either being simple or compound. You may also hear simple being referred to as closed. All right, so this is also a closed fracture, meaning that it didn't break through the skin. All right, didn't. All right, break through skin. Okay, and then you can also have a compound or open fracture. And that means that it did break through skin. Okay, and then there's a couple specific examples. So certain types of fractures that are very common from specific means of injury are given special names. Okay, and so here's two examples of that, and there are many others. All right, so one is a Call's fracture, and a Call's fracture is a fracture that occurs at the distal end of the radius. We'll just say distal radius. Okay, and so the radius is the arm bone. We'll learn about this in our next chapter. The arm bone on the thumb side of your arm, your forearm. All right, and so you get a fracture on the distal end near your wrist, right, of that bone. That's called a Call's fracture, and usually it's from falling with an outstretched arm, right, like to catch yourself. So you typically see that from falling. Right? Falling with an outstretched arm. Okay, so that's a Call's fracture. And another specific type of fracture is called a green stick fracture. So green stick fracture is seen very commonly in children. Okay, so children's, their bones are more flexible. And so what happens with a green stick fracture, all right, and the reason it's called a green stick fracture is if you've ever taken like a twig, right, from a tree, a fresh twig, break it off the tree, and you try to break it in half, a lot of times what will happen is that you'll get this kind of thing, right? So one end will bend and the other end will kind of splinter like this, all right? And that's actually what happens. I mean, the angle is a little extreme, right? But that's what happens with a green stick fracture, right? So fracture on one side, all right? And you get kind of more of a bone, not like you get more of a bend, not necessarily a break on the other side. And that's because children's bones are slightly more flexible than adults, okay? So you'll see this with children. All right, so that's it for our bone physiology chapter. In the next couple of chapters, we're going to be looking at the individual bones and how they're arranged and connected to